All right, thank you, Ken, for a nice overview of the wildfire risk to farm workers' health. So I think we had 5 really nice presentations that cover a really broad range of topics, hopefully demonstrating the wide range of climate risks to agriculture and food systems. We had an overview of the physical impacts of climate change on crop yield and cattle from Nathan. An overview of the climate risk to irrigation, talking about availability, but also quality, and some potential solution from Isaiah. We had a nice description of some concrete examples of how farmers are actively managing some of those climate risks by Carl. June gave us a nice overview of the impact of climate change, specifically focusing on heat stress and what it means for farm worker health. And then we had Kent, who talked about the impact of wildfires on the health and safety of farm workers, specifically focusing on the awareness and precautions. So I think hopefully that sort of demonstrate the wide range of topics related to climate risk and agriculture and food systems, and how it's a very challenging issue and quite complex with a lot of interactions. So I think we have about 20 minutes or so for a Q&A session. If you have any question, use the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom window, and feel free to ask any questions. Right now we have one question that I will ask that's directed to Nathan, a question from Matthew Gilbert, asking whether dryland farming is an alternative adaptation.
Great question, Matthew. Yeah, so, well, where I'm located here in Western Great Plains, we certainly have interspersed irrigated systems with dryland ranching and dryland cropping. And there are certainly stories about areas over the Ogallala Aquifer where pumping has become so prohibitive that you're seeing some switching to dryland farming. In California, my understanding of the dryland cropping is very rare, although I know there are some vineyards that are dry farmed in Northern California. So in the Southern Central Valley, I'd really have a hard time seeing that transition happen for places that do have irrigation infrastructure of some kind until, groundwater depletion and water rights kind of force the issue. But I certainly maybe others on the call who have additional insight into the California case.
Yeah, I could add to that, Nathan. There's some dryland farming on the vineyards, but it's little pockets, cooler areas that aren't as hot as the Central Valley. There's some old walnut and almond dryland farming I've seen on the Paso Robles Hills. They don't look too good. You might only produce 100 pounds an acre. So it's without the water, I don't think the production would be there in California's Central Valley.
All right, thank you. We have another question from Catherine Keske for Kent. So don't the ag workers currently experience impacts of biomass burning? And if so, could you address this briefly and speak to the additivity and scale?
Okay, thank you, Catherine, for that question. Yes, biomass burning is obviously is a major part of wildfire smoke exposures. We are aware that exposure to these particulates can have health effects on these workers. As mentioned, we talked about basically cough, shortness of breath, even a rapid heartbeat that can occur. Now, biomass burning, again, can be from a variety of different sources. And again, typically, if we're talking about burning of wood and that sort of material, that can also be a problem if that is part of the question that you're asking there.
Thank you, Kent. Another question from Andrea Thompson. What is a realistic projected timeline for automated trucks, tractors, and automated picking machines for agriculture? I think Maybe Carl, you might have some thoughts on that.
No, great question. I brought it up. It's my fault, so I'll answer it. I'm really hopeful, if we get a battery operated tractors. So we're talking now about changing the laws for not just cars, but also for large trucks transporting refrigerated food to people. And if they can get the larger trucks to hold a charge and, deliver the loads, I think we can do the same thing in the tractors and harvest equipment. And so I'm very hopeful that that'll be battery operated. We won't have to burn diesel anymore. Diesel is the most efficient form of power we have right now, but the success of the electric cars, I think, points to the fact that I think we can get to tractors being electric. And also with that, the fire smoke, there's probably a lot of questions in the field about fire smoke that because our equipment is mechanized for almonds, walnuts, pistachios, and wine grapes, they already have air-conditioned cabs for the heat illness prevention programs, and also we have filtration systems for the fine dust in the field. So hopefully that'll answer some other questions. Thank you.
Anybody wants to add anything to Carl's answer? No? Okay. So another question from Ken Bradford. If we could move enough water in wet years, could it be sufficient to restore groundwater aquifers in the San Joaquin Valley using the flooded methods that was described by Carl? And so maybe I'll ask Isaiah, because you also talked about recharging the aquifers, if you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, there are different estimates for available water to recharge aquifers, ranging from 300,000 million acre feet. How fast we can replenish depleted aquifers will depend on the infrastructure to move the water to where the soils are favorable to actually infiltrate the water fast enough. But for some aquifers, we have actually lost aquifer storage, especially in confined aquifers. So those would be harder to replenish. The answer is it is possible, but it will take a long time. We've been depleting aquifers for the last 2 to 3 decades. We can recharge the aquifers, but it will take time.
All right. Thanks, Isaiah. Anybody want to add anything?
I would like to ask a sort of a follow-up question to Carl. How many acres, or to what extent, are you using the flooding for recharge on your properties?
Well, we set aside about 5% of the land where we don't farm it. We will dry farm it, actually. And then in a wet year, we'll apply the water. In 2017, I think we were able to put enough water recharge to supply that property for 1 year's irrigation. So we're still dependent on bringing that well water back up in the dry years. We've also moved to share surface water with other neighboring water districts. So by using more surface water, we save our groundwater. So that trend is just starting. And I'd say we've set up several recharge areas on the properties we manage. And the water districts are excited, and they're figuring out when they have excess water that's going to spill and be uncontrolled, they will ask us if we'll apply it. Sometimes they'll charge us. Sometimes it's available because it's a wet year, and it's going to be downstream on it could be a city or another farmer if we don't do that. So we want to have the facilities available. We're not sure, as Isaiah said, what the long-term results might be. We're going to try.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I actually have a question. So I'll take an executive decision of asking a question for Kent and for June. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about some of the expectations, probably now and in the future, of having such bad air quality associated with wildfires or such major heat waves, that there's the potential to actually disrupt agricultural productivity by sort of shutting down farm workers and really impacting the production in various regions. It can be localized, it can be more widespread. I'm wondering if you could talk to that.
So I'll go ahead. June, if you'd like to begin now.
No, go ahead. That sounds good.
All right. Well, again, a really good question. I think that the concerns that we have is that we do know that, as June has shown, that there's this a rising increase in the temperature. And clearly that's going to impact on the types of crops that can be grown in certain regions of the country. I think adaptation, as was mentioned, is really a critical part of the success of agriculture in the Western United States. And also the fact that the workers, they need that work. And our greatest concern is that they will take increased risk at working. And that is what really needs to be done, where there needs to be some adaptation or mitigation to protect those individuals, as well as during the fact that if a wildfire event, again, many of these are very long-term, they're not acute. So it's over a period of time that those workers need to have the proper personal protective equipment, especially the respirators that do provide adequate protection. The cloth face coverings that we're using right now for COVID-19 are not adequate to protect workers against wildfire smoke.
Yeah, so I think if I can just follow up quickly. So could you see, for example, week or month-long heat waves where it would not be safe for farm workers to actually work and would actually prevent them to go in the fields in a way that would actually impact the harvest of. Do you think that's something that is at risk in the future, June?
Yeah, I agree with what Kent mentioned. I mean, I think we have sort of shorter term adaptations that we can make with good forecasting and planning in sort of the shorter term. And then there's these much longer term trends that I think we all have to work together to address, not just, the worker health and safety piece, but thinking about everything that's been discussed today with respect to crops and other aspects of land use. It also is the case, to sort of compound the question that you asked, we recently did an analysis in Washington, and I think this is kind of intuitive, but the periods where we have the most heat or heat waves they sort of line up with the periods where we have wildfire season, and they also line up with the activities that are going on in agriculture. For us, it's a lot of tree fruit harvests. So when we overlay the population, then the impacts, all these things kind of come together. So I think in the short term, there are strategies that folks are using with respect to protecting worker health. And I think we have to support those and be creative in thinking about how to implement those and how to, I think forecasting is something that's helpful because we obviously need to be able to plan in advance if we're thinking about impacts potentially on harvest and crops and so forth. So that's one piece that I think we could probably do more in the short term. But then in the long term, I do agree with Kent that that's going to involve more thinking about structuring of a variety of different aspects of agriculture, including labor, crops, and other aspects that I think folks on this call know a lot about or on this webinar.
So, Erwan, I just wanted to also add that we're seeing in California that when we have these long heat periods, that we're beginning to see more night work taking place as a way of compensating for trying to overcome the issues with high temperatures during the daytime.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's a very good point. So I have another question. In anticipation of temperature rising, are there commodities that California could begin planting now? And how would that affect the different areas discussed today? So I don't know if maybe Carl or Nathan could speak to that. What would be alternative crops or commodities that could be planted now or in the near future to prepare for climate change?
Yes, I think I was on a tour with Erwan to show him some of our facilities years ago. And he asked me what would happen if it was 4 degrees warmer. I was actually excited. I said I would plant avocados in the Central Valley if I had enough water. So I think that's what we do is we adapt. I had, unfortunately, years ago, farmed walnuts and avocados and citrus in LA County. And what happens is you get extra generations of pests. It's surprising. Instead of 4 generations, you may have 6 or 7 generations. So management will have to adapt. We'll have to monitor things closely, but I look forward to more citrus, avocados, where we wouldn't have the freeze issue that we have typically in the Central Valley. So if we can get 4 degrees, I think just 2 degrees, we might be able to get over that freeze hurdle and the avocados wouldn't die in the Central Valley. So I'm excited. I will adapt. And remember, these almond orchards, they only last 20 to 25 years. We would replant with whatever made the most sense at that time.
And so Nathan, maybe could you talk about how your research might be able to inform, how a transition to no communities could take place, and based on the nice analysis you did for California?
Sure. Yeah. Well, just to revisit that, one thing that emerged from our analysis of the county level data was that for the crops for which we were able to construct these good performing models, a lot of the crops actually didn't have a very strong temperature response. And, I think this is a little surprising as you look at a lot of other crops in other regions, and the production is very strongly temperature dependent. But here in these irrigated systems in California, really we looked at that 2-degree warming, the key crops for which we saw projected decreases were almonds and walnuts. And, California is already producing 80% of the world's walnuts. If the yields go down by 10%, I'm guessing California will still be producing a lot of walnuts, almonds. So it's kind of interesting, and I think it really speaks to perhaps thinking beyond just temperature, like Carl was saying about, or specific freeze events instead of just growing season or seasonal average temperatures, as well as thinking about the water supplies and what sort of crops make sense given the availability of water in different regions. And lastly, I just want to take one moment to revisit that ozone result that I think was pretty interesting. And I think that's in light of these potential for yield declines on at least some crops from increased temperature, continued air quality improvement and decreases in ozone is an opportunity to increase yields. And certainly seen that some with the air quality improvements of the last decade. So.
I want to ask Carl and Isaiah this question that came in about with our current water infrastructure in California and how growers get their water orders, how easy will it be to set up sort of automated irrigation systems?
Carl, you want to go first?
Oh, okay. Isaiah, I would like to take you on a tour someday.
Yes, I would love to.
I'll catch up with you. But yes, we're experimenting with several systems. It's interesting, technology is a cutting edge and you just don't want to bleed. So we try systems on a small scale and make sure they work before we do it incrementally before we roll it out over the entire area that we're going to farm. And some of them have failed, but they're getting closer, they're getting better. So the automation I'm talking about is where it monitors and turns on, but you're still in charge. You can still see the results on your sensors in the field, and the efficiency of your irrigation application. You want to make sure there's not a lot of leaks. It's turning on, and it's not going where it should be. So we're working on it. Say it's not perfected yet. It's a work in progress.
Yeah, as Carl said, it's a work in progress. So it's a lot easier to automate if you're pumping groundwater. But if you're getting water from an irrigation district, then you require some coordination. A few irrigation districts, for example, in the Central Valley, the Southern San Joaquin Irrigation District, part of their division has pressurized water on demand. So you get pressurized water, so such a system is easier to automate, as well as on the Central Coast, the Pajalo Valley Water Management Agency and Pajalo One Water all have pressurized water supply. A number of irrigation districts are at least looking at investing into this kind of infrastructure, because as we move to micro irrigations apply little water. They're very efficient, so they don't give you a lot of room for making mistakes. So you have to apply water whenever the crops need it. So I think that plus the need to provide other benefits like moving water for groundwater recharge would provide incentives to improve infrastructure for automated delivery.
All right, thank you for that answer. So we're coming in on 11:30 a.m. We have about 2 minutes left. So if there's a last minute question, this is really the moment to write it down in the Q&A before we close on this session. I'm not seeing anything. So, I want to thank all of our speakers for, I think, giving us a really exciting session that covered a lot. I was actually, I'll have to admit, a little bit worried that it was going to cover so much. It's going to be very difficult to sort of digest and taking all this information. And I was a little bit worried it was going to feel a little bit like doom and gloom. But I think it was actually quite nice to hear some of the potential solutions and adaptation strategies to some of those climate risks. So I think we're actually ending in a pretty positive and I think optimistic note for the future of agriculture in California, sort of a test bed of potential climate risks around the world. So I really want to thank all of our speakers, and feel free to reach out to us if you have additional questions. We can connect you to some of our speakers. We can send emails on your behalf as well, and try to get any additional question answered. Thank you all, and I hope you have a great day. And I also just want to mention that we have yet another session next week, October 21st at 10 a.m. Pacific time, which will be focusing on pursuing climate resilience. And you see here a list of the speakers. So I think it's going to be yet another exciting session. I invite you all to register on our website. And there'll be, yes, another session after that on October 28th, focusing on towards more equitable future. So please, feel free to join us for a really nice set of presentations and hopefully a nice and lively Q&A session. All right, so this concludes our session. On behalf of all the organizers, I want to thank again all the panelists and all the attendees for coming in and asking some great questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.